All right, so now we are on to really the U.S. impacts and implications of World War II. So most of this lecture series has been more about what was the overall impact on the world, what was going on at the time in Europe, Japan, in the Southeast Asia, Pacific, that area. Now we're going to talk about the basic effects on American economic, social, political, and cultural life. So this is going to be how is the U.S. impacted. And this is really the nuts and bolts of this course material. So we're talking about how did America get impacted by World War II, not how did World War II impact the world, which is what really we've been talking about for the most part. All right, so first we're going to talk about the home front, the War Production Board. So we had lots of auto manufacturers. We had people making all kinds of other stuff, whether it was like tools or not motorcycles really, yeah, but motorcycles did exist, bikes, things that people use in their daily lives that they wanted to buy as civilians. Well, those factories were also the perfect setup for wartime use as well. So basically, this was the U.S. not taking over factories, but they were providing contracts like Ford Motor Company saying, hey, we need you to start making tanks, not making Model Ts anymore, model whatever they've been on in the 40s. So they were basically kind of switching over production and what was used for. The second implication on the home front was rationing. This was kind of how it impacted mom and pop and everybody else. It regulated consumer use of various products. The idea was conserve raw materials that were in short supply. They would also encourage recycling. Things for like aluminum were a big deal. So there was a lot of Looney Tunes cartoons that actually like wanted you to recycle. They'd always make references to it, like these World War II era Looney Tunes cartoons would have it. This is what a ration book looks like. It basically they're what amount to food stamps. That's literally what they are. We think like the EBT or the SNAP card now. Well, back in the day, it used to actually be stamps, and these would be various stamps for various items. Sometimes food, sometimes supplies, sometimes aluminum supplies, sometimes it'd be tin supplies or copper in rare cases. But essentially, things that were in short supply that were needed for the war effort, but you still need them at home. So they ration them out to the home front so that more could be used on the war front. And just here's more examples of stamps from that era. All right, WACS. WACS stands for Women's Army Corps Service. This is basically how women join the military. They'd be in non-combat positions, so nurses, pilots, and we're talking non-combat pilots, and clerical, and they also be drivers. So they might drive ambulances, they might drive courier services. They were just for lack of a better term, a lot of the administrative work that was done. So, but nurses would often be very close to combat, so they could be where they might get shelled. So nurses were among casualties, the women were among casualties. They just weren't in formalized combat positions. They weren't carrying guns into combat. They weren't doing bomb runs, that kind of stuff. All right, women on the home front. Rosie the Riveter. This is a nickname for women who went to work in factories during World War II. Remember, factory work was mostly a male-dominated profession. But all the men, they're off at war. They've all been drafted. So who's going to replace them? Who's going to build the aircraft carriers? Who's going to do all this stuff? Well, the ladies do it. And Norman Rockwell had Rosie pose for for these pictures. Basically, it was a way to support and promote the idea of, hey, women, get out of the home and go replace your husbands who had to go to war, and that would keep this going, beat off the Japanese and take care of the Germans, take care of Adolf and all those people. And there is a Norman Rockwell version of Rosie the Riveter, modeled after the prophet Isaiah, a very famous painting from, I want to say, it was the Renaissance. And there were literally Rosie the Riveters all over the place whose job it was to rivet things together. Stick metal to metal. All right, there's also a second great northern migration during this time period. So the first major northern migration was African Americans, recently freed descendants of slaves during the Industrial Revolution. They were leaving the South, which was full of discrimination, to go to the North, where there were jobs and still discrimination. The same thing's happening here. We're having a big surge of need for employees. We need factory workers again because of the war effort. So we have another surge of people moving from the South to the North, mostly African Americans searching for a better life and trying to escape the poverty and discrimination that's in the South. Remember, there's not much industrialization in the South. It's still very agrarian. Lots of farms, very few factories. And then we got war bonds. War bonds were a huge thing because it was basically the government being loaned money by the people. They were trying to get the American public to buy war bonds to finance World War II because they had two choices. They could either tax the people, which they didn't want to do because they basically took the breadwinners, all the men, and sent them off to war. So how are they going to pay the taxes? So they were trying to get everybody who had any kind of disposable income to actually buy war bonds to help pay the war effort, and those bonds would then be paid back to the person who bought them at interest, and they make a little bit of money off of them. If you want a modern-day example of war bonds and how they were doing it, if you watch the very first Captain America movie from Marvel, when he becomes Captain America and is running around doing advertising, basically, he's advertising for war bonds. He's trying to get people to buy war bonds while he's Captain America. That's one of the first things he was doing in that fictional movie, but that kind of shows you that. But they would do that. They'd have celebrities out selling war bonds. They do war bond drives, trying to get people to buy as many as they could in a single location, make it like a public event. They do kind of like USO kind of shows to get people to buy war bonds because it was a great way to finance the war without putting money down right away and forcing heavier taxation. And here's an example of a war bond. There's Roosevelt on the left-hand side. All right, now for the nasty, unpleasant stuff about the war, if it wasn't already bad enough. Internment camps. All right, so after Pearl Harbor, and this is really only Pearl Harbor's impact, we had about 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast, and 70,000 who were citizens were sent to internment camps. They lost their homes, farms, their bank accounts were frozen. The only reason for this was, to be quite honest, they looked different, and there was a fear there were spies on the West Coast in the Japanese American population. That was the fear. It was mostly unfounded. It was certainly not necessary to put 6 figures of people in there, but it was just something that we did, and it was considered legal under a Supreme Court case we're going to talk about in just a second. The big implication of this, probably the most famous person who's alive today that talks about it on a regular basis would be oh gosh, he played Commander Sulu on Star Trek. I'm not going to remember his name. Oh, George Takei. George Takei. He actually did a Broadway play about his time when he was young, actually in an internment camp because he's of Japanese ancestry during the time of World War II. And people died in these camps. Now, and there was a bit of a stigma attached to them because of the concentration camp issue in Europe, but they weren't exactly pleasant, but they were more like jails if you really had to go with what they were. They had schoolhouses, they had churches, they had everything in there that you would normally, not unlike a lot of kind of prisons did. But they were basically just separated out because they were different. They were Japanese. They looked, and really the honest truth was because they looked different. Because guess what? There were a lot of people who were German in ancestry that were had much closer ties to Germany right now that weren't thrown into internment camps of any kind. But guess what? They're white and they look like everybody else, so they weren't discriminated against. This was a racially motivated ploy. This is a culturally motivated issue. And a lot of Japanese folks lost their homes because they couldn't pay the mortgages because they couldn't go to work because they'd been thrown into camps. And people took advantage of the situation, bought homes cheap, and sold them at high prices. It was a very unpleasant, nasty chapter in U.S. history. And this was anybody of Japanese ancestry, too. So you could, your grandparents could have come here. Your parents could have been born U.S. citizens. You were born a U.S. citizen. And if you have Japanese ancestry, you're going to that camp. That's one of the real, truly just unjust things about this. If it wasn't unjust enough already, but the fact that you're sitting there going, that guy's dad was German and he wasn't born an American citizen. My grandfather was. Why am I going to this camp and he's out free? Because there was just complete inequity in it. It was there was nothing uniform about it. It was just they look different, so we're going to put them in these camps, and that's just what we're going to do because we're scared. It was a fear-oriented imprisonment of an entire race of people in the U.S. It was just there's no excuse for it nowadays when we think about it. But at the time, have a little bit of historical empathy. People were scared to death. We'd basically been attacked on our own soil. Doesn't excuse it, but it does help to at least explain some of the sentiment behind it. And here are some Japanese folks getting on trains to actually go to the camps. And here's the local racism. And yes, there was a great deal of racism, especially after Pearl Harbor. But yeah, once Pearl Harbor happened, it was like you didn't want to be Japanese in a lot of places because they would kick you out. You get your house burned down. It almost be like being an African American activist in the Deep South during 1950. Like it was not a good time to be Japanese in the U.S. All right, Korematsu v. United States. This was basically the first challenge or major challenge to the internment camps as being illegal. Basically, the government said they had the right to intern anyone based on threats to national security. This is a wartime issue. Now, if they weren't, and a big impact on this is the fact that war was actually formally declared. So we had a declared war against Japan. these people are Japanese. We need to separate them out. That was the basis. It was a fear issue. It was a fear of espionage, of spying, and they said they're a threat to national security, so we're going to put them in these various camps, and that's how they handled it. And the Supreme Court said it's okay because we're at war, and this is based on national security. And so the takeaway from this is absolutely yes, this could in theory happen again, legally. All right, and that's the end of this lecture.